You're listening to Infinite TBR, the podcast where we try not to buy more books. I'm Smack.
And I'm Gabi. Spoiler alert! We're going to avoid major spoilers, and when we can, warn when we're going to discuss a particular book in detail so you can avoid that part of the episode. You can also check the show notes for time-stamped flags identifying potential spoilers.
Hello again, Smack. Hi, Gabi. I missed you.
It's been like a whole 3 minutes since we were recording. So welcome back. This is going to be our bonus episode about genre stigma in its various forms that we are familiar with, anyway.
So which genre, are you familiar with any genre stigma? Has anyone ever, made fun of you for reading in various genres?
I can't think of any specific examples of someone off the top of my head. I'm sure I've encountered it. I'm more familiar with general genre stigma in that there's sort of this ambient sense you pick up that certain genres are less legitimate than others.
Yes.
For example, you are more reluctant to admit to people, especially to men, I found out, that you read romance novels.
Absolutely.
Even just carrying a book around, I run into this, are you a big reader? And that always throws me off because in my head, everyone is a reader. But apparently, even that in of itself is unique. And then once people find out that I am a speculative fic reader,
right.
That's another thing that always throws me off because I do sometimes get those, not necessarily snide comments, but kind of the, so fiction, kind of,
right.
Or, fantasy, and then we have, this brief discussion over, I have a hard time putting myself into a secondary world type thing, or, something that isn't believable, and people have a hard time with magic and stuff like that, and that's not necessarily not a legitimate stance to take, especially with people who aren't as familiar
right. or if you don't
attracted
understand
to that.
Genre conventions.
Mm-hmm.
I read, I guess it was last month, I read the first military science fiction book I'd read in a long time, and there was a lot of world building at the beginning of it, and I am not familiar with military stuff at all.
Right.
So there was a learning curve.
Yes, and that becomes especially a thing depending on how much invented world building the author's doing. I'm thinking specifically at the moment of, I want to say Rowan by Anne McCaffrey? The Rowan by Anne McCaffrey, which was a hard sci-fi series.
By Anne McCaffrey. Wow.
And it was a lot of, and hard sci-fi often has this thing where they not necessarily, they make up a lot of science, and they attach a lot of made-up scientific terms to what's happening. And depending on how skilled they are, they're consistent about that, but it can definitely be a steep, that's what always, for some reason, I have a better time adapting to, I guess what I consider traditional secondary world fantasy, magic. For some reason, I have a better time with made-up magic rules.
You mean the scientist?
Sci-fi.
Has... Can let go more during a fantasy read rather than a science fiction read? Who would have foreseen this?
Some of it, I think, actually has more to do with being on a spaceship doesn't appeal to me in the same way riding a dragon does. I guess if that makes sense.
So the self-insertion appeal.
Yes, I guess. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing to self-reflect on and be like, why am I the way that I am?
I don't want to go to space. I want to ride a dragon.
But anyway, coming back to genre stigma, that's the type of stuff I tend to run into, and I notice it most in terms of that interesting gender disparity, because I do think this is a lot worse for men.
Yes. But I mean...
If I'm thinking about romance specifically, I guess.
Right. But even if you're just carrying a book around, I have noticed that there is a very... Not that I talk to a whole lot of people in the world anymore. Or carry
in
physical,
the world.
Yeah. So I have noticed that with respect to book covers, certain...
Ooh, yeah.
So, certain book covers will get various responses from the people around you. The Love Con by Ceresia Glass, I think it is.
This is kind of where you get into phrases like bodice rippers. That refers to a very specific type of cover.
So yeah, the Love Con by Ceresia Glass is bright pink.
Mm-hmm.
Like Valentine pink. And I would probably be, I mean, I wouldn't anymore, but like several years ago I might have been hesitant to take that out of the house into like a Starbucks or read or whatever. Mm-hmm. Whereas The Siren of Sussex by Mimi Matthews is also clearly romance. There's a woman riding a horse on the cover, but it's like teal instead of bright pink. So it's less objectionable, I guess, to the casual observer.
Right.
And one of them is contemporary romance. And frankly, the Love Con is about like first it has a fat black woman as the main character. And she goes onto a reality show where you cosplay various characters.
Okay.
So that one's contemporary fantasy. The Siren of Sussex is not Regency, but historical romance in England. And so even within a genre that may or may not be disparaged by other people, there are various levels of like appropriateness to take out of the house.
And what was most likely to invite comments from strangers.
Right. Yes. And I think romance and horror are the two biggest disparaged genres in general. And I think that's mostly, well, I mean, science fiction and fantasy used to be among that.
Right.
But stuff like Game of Thrones and TV shows, Firefly even, have really rehabilitated that image and sort of expanded the number of fans.
Yeah, the fan base.
Yeah, that would be attracted to it. But horror and romance are very commercial. Mm-hmm. They are, I find that horror, literary horror, quote unquote, is like really good. But that's the same way you could like make literary science fiction, where like the Emily St. John Mandel books, those are like literary horror.
Yeah, and actually my dad sent, speaking of Emily St. John Mandel, my dad sent something the other day, a quote that she gave about when she was first getting, because Last Night in Montreal is her first book, and I think I mentioned when I was talking about it, normally, that she incorporated this weird speculative element that, like, she just barely introduces for no apparent reason and then backs off of it. And my dad sent this follow-up thing about, it says GR, so I assume this is a Goodreads interview, where someone had asked, it feels like the old school distinctions between literary fiction and genre fiction are finally starting to break down. Incorporating speculative fiction elements is no longer against the rules for quote-unquote serious books. And she responded, it's been exciting to see the way the literary world has changed in that regard. I think it's a more expansive and generous way to think about our literature. It used to be a lot different. My first novel, Last Night in Montreal, was rejected by probably 35 publishers before it found a home. A lot of the rejection letters came down to the question of where it would be shelved. We don't know how we would market a book that's both detective fiction and literary fiction. Yeah. Whatever that is. Yeah. So that gets to this whole concept of literary fiction, which we recently had a chat about. And how the word literary makes my eye twitch. What does it mean?
Yes. Especially in recent, last 10, maybe 20 years. But when I was an undergrad, it was not okay to write science fiction or fantasy. Any genre convention, basically if you weren't writing either literary fiction or memoir, you were looked down upon. And this was like the late aughts.
So this is kind of getting into writing versus reading.
Yes, that's
how
true.
those stigmas are a little bit different.
Right.
So.
Because when you're reading, you can, that's why we have the term guilty pleasure. Mm-hmm. You can hide your book.
Nobody has to know how much fan fiction you have open on your phone.
Or the introduction of e-readers. Apparently, bodice rippers, the sales of those skyrocketed.
Fascinating.
Because you can sit on the subway or whatever.
That's a good point.
And nobody has to know.
Oh, that's where this really actually, where I notice this the most is when I'm on an airplane. I am most cognizant of what I am reading because it is open to whoever is next to me,
and the people who are sitting across the aisle and behind you.
And I can't stop, even when I'm on an e-reader, I'm like, sometimes if whatever it is getting risque, I'm like, start tilting in the other direction.
Or if it's like, if it's not just straight, like, banter or very, like,
innocuous
PG stuff, whether that be horror or romance or whatever. There's something about being on a plane where you just cram together with so many people and you're so on top of each other that you can't help but notice what the people around you are doing.
Yep. And you're just hyper aware of how you just have no privacy.
Yes. So
anyway,
that's an extreme example for sure.
But writing versus reading.
Yeah, but...
So writing.
So writing, you have to put your name on it. Whether or not you use a pseudonym, you get it workshopped by other writers, and if they don't like the genre, they will tell you. And they will tell you. So when I was an undergrad in the late aughts, I was a creative writing major, and it was a nightmare.
I do remember, and now that, again, memories being triggered, the one class I took through CCS that was like the creative writing workshop, where it's the only time I've ever shared writing with strangers. I think I was one of the only people writing. I was writing basically romantic fantasy at the time. I think the chapter I had to share didn't have any of that in it, but it's like, that was definitely my ultimate intent. And even if it wasn't like obvious that's where it was headed, it still had that vibe. Yeah. And it didn't occur to me at the time until everyone started sharing that I was maybe going to be the only one who... Because, I mean, that was my catnip, so that's the stuff that not that I write a lot at all, but, like, all of my writing ideas have to do, basically, with that. So, yes, now that you mention it, that was very different.
And it's entirely possible it was primarily that program, which, like, set itself apart from the rest of the university, but, like...
And it ended up being okay. Like, no one tore me to pieces, but I felt weird.
Yes. Yes, feeling weird is the best case scenario in those cases. To the point where, like, when I was looking for grad schools, creative writing MFA programs, like, I would email alumni and I would email professors and be like,
how do you feel?
Yes, how do you feel about science fiction and fantasy, specifically? And so many people. And this was... 2013, 2014, 2015, like, so many people were like, I would never go to that program if I had known that, like, they didn't care about YA, they didn't care about science fiction, romance, anything.
That's another thing we should maybe mention really quick is the YA.
Yes, that's a good point. YA is a little complicated because there's this whole facet of, like, adults reading YA.
Yes.
And there being a different audience than actual young adult readers.
Right.
But adults reading YA is... sort of an embarrassing thing.
Yes. But very common.
Incredibly common.
Yeah.
It's something like half of all YA readers are adults.
But for some reason it's still like...
Yeah.
We don't talk about it.
Well, because the rest of... anybody who doesn't read YA sort of just assumes, like, you're reading kids' books.
Yeah.
Whereas YA has evolved way beyond that. Even, like, 10 years ago when The Hunger Games came out or whatever. Like, that was...
And there are even plenty of adults reading middle grade and kids, like...
Exactly.
There's no reason to limit yourself to an age group. There is very much the expectation that
you do so.
That you do.
Yeah. Yeah, like, I've found some really good middle grade books I like to read, but going back to having to share, even before you're published, like, you have to stake your claim and be like, I am writing YA fantasy, or science fiction romance, or... werewolf horror, whatever. You do have to own it. And in order... I don't know. The whole thing is sort of depressing to me. But it has gotten a lot better in recent years. But not across the board, necessarily.
Right, of course.
I went to a fairly small MFA program for grad school, mind. Like, not everyone who wants to write speculative fiction... Not everyone. Many people who want to write speculative fiction don't have the opportunity to go to an MFA program. And frankly, side note, you don't need to. But the program I chose was relatively new. It's unconventional, and part of its unconventionality is that it specifically has a track for genre fiction.
Right.
like, I got to give this speech at graduation, and one of the things,
I
didn't even remember it, I was so stressed.
Yeah. How a lot of my public speaking goes.
Yes.
I have no memory of it, but I remember the lead up.
Yep.
I remember the come down.
Mm-hmm.
The entire event is...
I know I made one more dragon joke than I intended to, and I thought, God damn.
Can you ever have enough dragon jokes?
Well, I wanted to do, like, a dragon joke and a science fiction joke. Anyway. I don't remember the speech, but afterwards, one of my classmates, who, I think she's a poet, came up to me afterwards and was like, that's so interesting that you chose this program because you have been made fun of for writing science fiction and fantasy in the past. I would have never thought of that, because, like, poetry, like, although horror and speculative poetry is a whole other thing.
Right. Something I didn't even really knew was a thing before, like, this year.
Yeah. I mean, like, I feel like it's sort of getting its turn in the sun a bit.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to think that.
I know. I hope that's how it's going.
Yes.
So it's... The more commercial a genre is, I have found, no, that's not true, because thrillers are fine, because thrillers are associated with guys.
Ooh.
And so a thriller or a mystery, not like a cozy mystery, but like...
As soon as it's cozy, it's way too feminine.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But like a cop
hard-boiled.
Yeah. All that stuff would have been fine, even 20 years ago in an undergrad class.
Right.
Like, it's acceptable. But the second you put anything in there that a woman might like, it gets iffy.
Anything that's traditionally feminine coded.
And that's even built into the marketing for traditionally published books. You have literary fiction, and then you have women's fiction.
Ooh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was at a bookstore recently, I don't remember which one it was, but I had meant to send you a picture. They had something like a men's section, like a men's fiction or a men's...
Really?
And I was like, what the fork is this?
That's so interesting!
Yes.
I've never heard of that.
I know.
I'm sure that's probably not the first time it happened, but, like, that is a deliberate choice. I'm very proud of them.
Yeah,
whoever it was.
Yeah, I couldn't decide how I felt about it at the time, but now that we're talking about how, like, usually the default is
the masculine
coded stuff, yeah. I actually, since we're on the topic, I thought it was interesting when we were talking about planning this episode, you were including horror as one of these stigmatized genres, and I had never considered horror as a stigmatized, because so in my head there's a lot of overlap between horror and thriller. So I kind of think of them, like, my brain just honestly defaults to Stephen King, and Stephen King is, like, the example of what is acceptable.
Yes.
Which
he is a horror writer who made it.
Okay. But there is this distinction between thriller and horror that I am not always clear on.
Yeah, that's fair, because there is a lot of overlap. And when I say horror, I just automatically go to, like, speculative horror.
Right.
Vampires, werewolves.
Yes.
Aliens. I don't know.
Right.
Scary, speculative stuff.
Yes. And it's also interesting that in recent years, or maybe not so recent now, but this is kind of split further into, like, now you'll see categories in the bookstore for, well, there's paranormal romance versus romance. There's urban fantasy, or urban, like, sometimes the werewolf and vampire stuff gets separated into a different, kind of gets, like, the boundaries between urban fantasy and paranormal romance and romance kind of, like, all get, and then once they start trying to make those divisions, like, what are you doing?
Yes, because it's totally subjective, and those are more marketing terms than anything else. But horror, I think specifically for women writing horror, is an odd duck, or viewed as such.
Yes. Now I'm sitting here trying to think of, I guess we've talked before about, like, Kennetra Brooks, an academic.
Yes. And
Octavia Butler?
I don't know.
Would you?
Not the stuff I've read.
I'm trying to think of what I'd classify Kindred as. That's more...
Kindred's like historical fiction.
Historical fiction.
Yeah. Historical science
fiction. Yeah, it's
fiction.
definitely not horror.
Some of Carmen Maria Machado's stuff is horror.
Sure. Isabella Yaps.
Yes. So, like, they're around.
Yeah, they're there.
And I think they're around more than they have been, historically. I think...
As with most.
Yes. I think as it becomes more acceptable for women to write horror, and more likely that women writing horror will be published...
Right.
The kind of story that appears in the horror genre has expanded beyond just, like, gore or rape or...
Yup.
Psychological horror.
Right.
So, like, there are certain things that are staples of the genre, but this goes for, like, anyone other than cishet white guys. Like, if you get someone who is different from the default to write a story, you'll get some really interesting stories. And to the point that more non-white people and more women and non-men are publishing horror, I think the genre has expanded. The fan base for the genre has expanded as well. And as that happens, it becomes more acceptable.
Yep. So did you say everything you wanted to say about picking up stigmas in an academic setting? Because you're the one who's kind of been subjected to this.
So, like, I went to a program that was specifically for science fiction and fantasy creative writing. I mean, I say science fiction and fantasy, it was for speculative fiction, right, which runs a much larger gamut. Yeah. And that includes romance.
Right.
But I was there for 2.5 years, and I met exactly one person who said specifically, I write romance. Anyone who put a romantic subplot in their stories, most of them are women. Mm-hmm.
But their books are sci-fi or fantasy. They're
right.
Not romance.
Yes. This woman wrote contemporary and historical romances. And YA romances.
Good for her.
I know! And she was really smart and really lovely, and I had a wonderful time talking to her about writing. But she was very clear that she had people question or dismiss her writing. Of course, I know. And some of the ways they did that was by saying that romance is so formulaic that, like, as long as you hit the beats, the story beats, which do exist and are helpful for plotting a story, and romance has specific plot beats to hit. And so, in a workshop, someone would tell this woman, basically, why can't you fix it yourself? Like, it's not worth our time to fix for you. Yeah. And it wasn't quite so blatant as that, because the 1 or 2 times it happened, like, the faculty shut them down hard. Because it was, like, generally a safe space. Not always. Clearly not always.
Yes.
So it wasn't blatant. It was very much like a sort of just a dismissive feeling she would get, which is even harder to discuss, right?
Yes.
But I do think it's incredibly telling that out of all these commercial genres, absolute darkest horror to, like, PG, YA, fantasy or whatever, all the extremes, one single romance writer in 2.5 years.
Admitted it.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. And, I mean, she was lovely in that she was, like, trying to establish that, like, there is a romance writer in this program, and there could be other romance writers in this program. But she was definitely going against the tide.
Oh.
Yeah.
Props to you!
I know. I love you, Diane. And so that was even in a program where genre and commercial fiction is acceptable.
Right.
Like,
and they're trying to nominally fight back against that. I know.
And then, I mean, these poor people who go to, like, I don't know, Iowa Writers Workshop, which is, like, the Harvard business of writing programs. Or, like, Columbia, or North Carolina, or Colorado, any of these, like, well-established literary writing programs.
It's interesting how this pattern seems to reemerge in different spheres of just life in general, how you'll have, like, this, like, mainstream and then, like, the marginalized, right? And then the most mainstream of the marginalized kind of get accepted in the mainstream, leaving behind smaller and smaller subsets of intersectional margins and all that.
That absolutely applies outside of fiction writing.
Interesting. So, what has been your experience learning and unlearning some of the stigmas that you've run into during your writing?
It's a conscious unlearning.
Yeah. I know for me, for the general stuff, it's been a very much like just trying to psych myself up to be like, no, I'm proud of whatever I'm writing. If you want to, like, and some of it comes down to whether I want to potentially deal with someone, a stranger, approaching me and talking to me about it. Like, sometimes I just don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
And that's what the decision comes down to, but especially, like, as I get older, I know I'm more inclined to get this attitude of, I'm gonna do what I want.
Yeah.
No matter, like, and if you have a
Fuck
problem with
everyone
it,
else.
I will fight you. But that is definitely, like, a difficult stance to take, and sometimes I just simply do not have the spoons for it. So.
Yes. And since becoming friends with this woman at grad school, I have, and that was, 2017, 2018? Since then, I'm still unlearning this impulse to hide the fact that I enjoy romance. Like, I enjoy it. I have found various subgenres that I do enjoy. I'm not a big paranormal romance fan, but, like, if it's good, it's good.
Right.
And honestly, like, I don't write romance yet. Perhaps. We'll see. But, like, to find these online spaces of romance writers, these women are so smart. They're really well educated. Like, Courtney Milan clerked for Stephen Breyer. So, like, and there's this, like, joke where lawyers turn into romance writers because there's so many of them. And, like...
Way to take a hard turn.
I know, and Stacey Abrams has romance books that she wrote.
Yes. I feel like I would be remiss also if I didn't toss in my aunt here.
Yes,
Mary
that's
Janice
true.
Davidson, who is a paranormal romance writer and is hilarious. She writes Betsy the Vampire. Those who are familiar with her are very familiar with her, and they're incredible. So...
Yeah. So, and it goes a little bit back to covers, sort of. Like, what degree could a stranger tell
yes.
what I'm reading?
Yep.
And so, like, learning to, like, not care about other people, that's just, like, a maturation. And that just comes with, like, growing up and getting older.
And giving fewer forks.
Yes. Which is such a delightful state of being.
Yes.
But it has recently come to my attention that I have multiple times been like, oh, I'm not really a horror fan.
Yes.
But in fact, I love horror. I haven't taught myself to be like, yes, you like horror. You have enjoyed this and this and this and this and this. That means you're a horror fan.
It's extra hilarious to me. I pointed this out to her this week because I am finally reading Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones, which is as horror as you can get, basically. And she's been pushing this book at me for years, and some of it is that Smack's specialty is werewolves, right. So she's very widely read just of werewolves in general, so that tends to be where her horror reads come up.
And this one, I'm going to interrupt you, because Mongrels is the exception in that it was one of the first horror books I read after college.
Okay.
And so like
post-thesis.
Pre-thesis.
Okay.
So...
Oh, after undergrad.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, like, I'd only ever read, like, YA werewolf, like, Raised by Wolves by Jennifer Lynn Barn, or those Anita Blake books, right. I think. They have werewolves, I think.
I don't think I've read them, but
like, I hadn't read any horror werewolves, and so that was my gateway book.
Oh, well, that explains a lot. So, for anyone who's read, and then The Devourers by Indra Das is also a very good example of this. Both of those books.
I wouldn't have picked, I don't know if I would have picked up on my own, but Indra is a friend of a friend.
Right.
And another clearing person. Yeah, another clearing person. And so our mutual friend handed me an ARC, an advanced reader copy, and was like, I will give this to you if you write a review online. I was like, yeah!
Okay.
And it turned out to be amazing and super freaking dark.
Yep.
So much darker than I expected, and I loved it because it was different from what I had been reading.
So this is where we get back to, you're liking the weird stuff.
Yes.
You seem to like the violent stuff, the gross.
I even like body horror.
I know, you're just...
Like Hench by Natalie Zena Walscotts. I'm really sorry for mispronouncing that. But, like, that's body horror.
The Stars Are Legion by Cameron Hurney.
Legion, that is more body horror. Yep. And, like, I'd always thought of body horror as, like, I don't know, like, pimples and stuff, and, like, I don't know, like, weird shit. I was like, why would you read about your body being violated?
Right.
But it's more than that.
So Mac has a new appreciation. Not so new appreciation.
Not so new. Newly realized.
Newly
for
realized. Sure. And a few, possibly even in one of these episodes, you had said, I don't read a lot of horror.
Yes. And then I did a correction on the next one. I was like, I totally read horror. I'm just not good at saying it yet. But this is exactly what it is. Like,
yes.
This is me unlearning the horror stigma. And, like, I wouldn't have done the romance stigma unless I met people who were like, yes, I am a romance fan. Don't make fun of me, you dick bod, or I don't know.
Those names people definitely call to your face in the past.
That's my go-to.
You know how romance writers are.
Exactly. Heathens, all of them.
So, as far as if you too are looking to unlearn some of your genre stigmas.
And it's hard to unlearn them on your own, particularly because one of the most important parts I've found is someone else being like, you totally should read this, or you were talking about this other book you loved. Isn't that the X genre or whatever? Like, it takes help to unlearn stigma.
And it helps to have reading buddies who are on the same page. And having that safe space to be able to say it and talk about it and know that those closest to you won't judge you if you have that privilege.
Yes. Especially, I was going to say it helps when you find good books in that genre. Yes. Which is, like, sort of obvious, but, like...
Every genre and subgenre, I think, have their gateway ones that are...
They're popular enough that they reach an audience that the rest of the genre doesn't necessarily.
Exactly.
Like with The Martian for science fiction. Yeah. A lot of people read that who don't usually read science fiction.
This is my brother Tony's favorite book, The Martian.
I did not make fun of it.
This is an ongoing joke in my family that I feel compelled to make because my brother hates The Martian. Okay, continue.
Oh, okay.
I don't even know that he's read it. I think the movie. I think mostly they talk about the movie. I don't either. Like, I haven't seen it. I haven't read it.
Well, apparently Andy Weir is a really nice guy. So
hard
to hate it too much.
I actually have seen the movie. I have now seen it.
Very memorable, I'm sure.
Anyway, gateway.
Yes.
Novels.
Yeah. So the most popular books aren't necessarily going to be everybody's jam, but they will help pull in readers or fans more generally
who are new to the
genre. Yeah.
I think also, I'm thinking of my brothers now, Game of Thrones has been a big gateway for getting, for example, my little brother Joe back into reading fantasy stuff, and now he's read, like, the whole Witcher series.
Wow.
So yeah, it's interesting what will hook a person into a genre or a subgenre, but you can always find them. Always find those books.
Another interesting example would be Ice Planet Barbarians, which I have unfortunately not read yet.
I haven't read those either, but I want to.
I have friends who are, like, I have one friend who loved it, another friend who doesn't usually read that stuff, and he was like, yeah, it was good. And then I saw it as it's a self-published series of, like, science fiction romance where Ice Planet people and
who are
barbarians. But it's been in Kindle Unlimited, which means you have to have a subscription. Ew. But now the paperback, it's so popular that the paperback is at Barnes & Noble.
Congrats to...
I don't know.
Someone!
Ruby Dixon.
Congrats!
Oh my god, look at this cover.
Oh my god, that's awesome!
That is a romance cover.
Congrats to you! Get that on the
Absolutely.
Another way to go about this is
this is the one they have at Barnes & Noble.
Oh wow, that's very different.
Very different.
I was so sure that the other one was the one that they managed to put.
Nope. The other one is the one that, like, got them all the popularity. This one is...
We're legitimate.
Yeah.
We do...
Mass appeal.
We'll post both covers in the show notes.
It's very interesting to compare those.
If you want to see it before we get around to doing show notes, we highly recommend you look up both covers for Ice Planet Barbarians.
By Ruby Dixon.
And see the contrast. Another good way, if you're looking to explore, like, break out of your comfort zone and explore different genres or subgenres, look up your favorite authors. A lot of times different authors will diversify.
Genre jump, it's called.
One really awesome, striking example to me, just because she's been coming up a lot in our reading, is Sylvia Moreno Garcia.
Who we have talked about fairly extensively in previous episodes.
Pretty much every new book she comes out with is a completely
different genre.
Yeah.
It's
truly incredible.
It's really impressive, the range of books she's put out. But, like, the one, Mexican Gothic, that one won her a bunch of awards. It catapulted her into, like, more mainstream appeal. And that's also body horror. That one is too much for me. But it was...
We found some excellent... Okay, as being in the middle of mongrels, I am so curious now what that limit could possibly be.
Oh my goodness. You will know when you read it. You will know right away what my limits are.
Interesting. Also thinking back to Devourers, I'm like, what?
Yeah,
what could
that's fair. Devourers
possibly be?
Well, it's an amazing book. I mean, that's part of, like, the journey of unlearning stigma, is that you're going to find books in this genre that you supposedly don't like, that you don't like.
Right.
Like, it doesn't matter how well written it is. Yes. It's not really your thing.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that's typical of that subgenre genre. It's just, it's part of learning what things you like and what things you don't like.
And you do have to keep an open mind about that. And you're right, it is, like, it's not even... Don't throw horror out with the baby bathtub. It's whatever that saying is.
Don't throw horror out with the baby bathtub, guys.
But, like, don't discount the entire genre. But don't discount that specific subgenre either.
Right.
It takes time to learn what you like.
Yep. We also recommend that you ask booksellers, reach out on Twitter. Twitter will
drown you in recommendations.
You can ask us. We have lots of opinions that may or may not fit your opinions, but we'll sure have opinions to share.
And we will try to tailor them if you tell us.
We'll do our best.
I liked this, but I didn't like this. What else should I read? We will give it a shot.
You can also look up best sellers in various subgenres online. Unfortunately, the easiest way is Amazon.
The river that shall not be named.
The river that shall not be named. But Barnes & Noble and probably also IndieBound have ways of searching for those as well.
I will say, this is probably unfair, but I'm going to say it anyway. I have had better results asking booksellers at independent bookstores rather than asking booksellers at places like Barnes & Noble for recommendations. And I don't know why that is. I think it's possible that indie bookstores, while they carry less stock, they carry a wider range of books.
I would also, and this may also be unfair or untrue, I think of Barnes & Noble employees as A, having more turnover.
Yes.
B, it's less of a, I don't know if vocation's the right word, but you get people who love books. But being a Barnes & Noble employee is more about a temp gig in high school or in college to, like, get you enough spending money to, like, you know, exist as a teenager or a young adult.
Do you know I applied to be a Barnes & Noble person really 6 times?
Wow.
I did it the second I turned 16 and was legal to do so. I did it every year. I was home for the summer. I never got that job.
Wow.
You know? And I don't want it anymore, but, like...
Right. Because the job is more about, like, shelving and...
talking to people?
And I get the impression that working in an independent bookstore, it becomes more about your familiarity with...
the customers,
the books,
the relationships within the industry that you build. Whereas you were right, there's a lot of turnover at Barnes & Noble, and there's a lot of pressure from corporate, who generally, like independent bookstore owners, are way more invested in community and like promoting local people and like building a community.
Right. And they can tailor themselves to the community.
And they're not limited by shareholders.
Right. So
boo corporations.
Boo his boo. So I think that's all we had to say on... Is there anything else you would like to say about
I think so. I think we're good.
Okay. So, here's hoping you don't throw the horror out with the baby bathwater.
That's fair. Okay. See you next time.
This has been another episode of Infinite TBR. You can find us on our Twitter at Infinite TBR. And we are individually on Twitter as at What Smack Said and at Gabalodon, which is like Megalodon, but Gab in the front of it. And you can find all our show notes at infinitetbr.com. If you have book recommendations for us or questions you want answered during the podcast, feel free to email us at itbrshelf@gmail.com.